Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome. My name is Jenny, and I'm a part of the communications team here at SP Jain. It's a lovely Saturday morning and a great day to discuss some world politics and diplomacy, now, isn't it? Don't you agree that the 2020 presidential elections in the US had its fair share of soap opera style twists and turns? And now, with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris elected president and vice president, what does that mean for the world? More specifically, what does it mean for India and the future of India US relations? We are here today to discuss all these and more, and I honestly cannot think of anyone better suited than Amit Dasgupta to lead the way. Before we begin, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to quickly remind everyone that we have a 45-minute session planned for you all, which will be followed by a detailed Q&A round that will go on for another 45 minutes. For better connectivity, I will request everyone to please turn off your video and to ensure that your audio is on mute. At any point, if you have any questions, please type them out and send them to me using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. I will read them out one by one during the Q&A. With that, I'd now like to invite Mr. Nitish Jain, President of SP Jain Global, to formally welcome our guest and speaker for today. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Jenny. And hi, Amit. Thanks for accepting our invitation, and that too at very short notice. So it is very much appreciated. I formally, warmly welcome my good friend Amit Dasgupta, a former Indian ambassador. I welcome also our students, alums, and staff of SP Jain. I welcome many of our corporate guests who have taken the trouble to be with us today to this wonderful seminar, or let's say webinar, The World and India Under a Biden Presidency. You know, at a personal level, I dread to think what would have happened to the world for 4 more years under the current US president. But that's for another story, because it is Amit Dasgupta who will share with us what we can expect. So, you know, the power of the US president is enormous. He or she, could be Kamala Harris in 4 years, we don't know, could cause tectonic shifts in military collaborations, trade, climate change, stock markets, and even the price of commodities like oil and gold. To predict what impact this could have for the world, and especially for India, we have with us a very eminent person, Amit Dasgupta. But let me take a few minutes to introduce him. Amit has had a ringside view of Indian diplomacy, as he was a career diplomat for over 25 years, having served in Cairo, Brussels, Kathmandu, Berlin, Sydney, and finally ending up as the Indian ambassador to the Philippines, based in Manila. His vast knowledge led him to author 15 books, including The Strategic Shape of the World and India for a Billion Reasons. And as I mentioned, there are many other best-selling books authored by Amit, but I just thought that pertinent to today's topic are these 2 books. After retiring as a diplomat, we at SP Jain had the great honor of him joining us as a professor and the head of our Mumbai campus. I had the great pleasure of interacting with Amit. Given his remarkable network, he helped the school to get a great footing. After leaving us, he is now part of the highly ranked University of New South Wales as a strategic advisor. And I can tell you firsthand, he's doing an outstanding job for UNSW. Amit has had blue chip education, having studied at St. Xavier's College, Calcutta, Jawaharlal University in Delhi, and then he won a highly coveted Indian government 2 year scholarship to McGill University in Canada. And I'm sure all of us know how highly ranked or how reputed McGill is in Canada. A highlight of his illustrious career was when he was awarded a gold medal. And fortunately, I was present. I was present when this gold medal was presented to him by the New South Wales government in Australia in recognition for his contribution during his tenure as the Indian Consul General in promoting multiculturalism and harmony during a difficult time when attacks on Indian students threatened to disrupt bilateral relations. And I can again share with you on a personal note, I was in Sydney in 2008 when we were planning the SP Jain campus in Australia, and Amit was the consul general at the time. And I asked Amit, I know you have an official role as the consul general, but for me, setting up this campus means a lot. It's a huge financial investment we're making, and we have a lot at stake. So please advise me, Indian to Indian.
The literature, how it's the grammar, the way you have writing, we want to see all that.
Sorry.
What grammar?
Would you please mute? Okay, so as I was saying, I was in Sydney at a personal level. I asked Amit, should we go ahead with this campus? And he assured me, he said, Nitish, just go ahead and set up this campus. Nothing will happen. And he was absolutely right. We are now 12 years later with the Sydney campus operating superbly well. And we have so many students. Every year we have more than 600 students who study in Sydney, and they all have a very, very pleasing experience. So I'm going to end with just say that along with his wife, Amit currently resides in Delhi, and his lovely daughter, who's celebrating her anniversary today, lives in Sydney along with her husband. So ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. Amit Dasgupta.
Thank you very much, Nitish, for this extremely warm welcome and introduction. And thank you also, Jenny. It's a humbling feeling to once again interact with students, with faculty, and with all of you from SP Jain. My memories of the association that I've had with SP Jain, as Nitish said, goes back many years. It goes back to the time when I came to know Nitish as an individual, as the president of SP Jain, but I didn't know him very well at that point of time in the early years when SP Jain was going to open a campus in Sydney. But as time passed, and as Nitish so wonderfully put it, a friendship and a relationship grew. And that culminated in my joining the Mumbai campus as the first inaugural head. And it is there that I met a number of you, and I am the better for it, for having known you, for having enjoyed your warmth, your friendship, and your affection. Please accept my gratitude. The topic that's been given is something that everyone's talking about all over the world. And to my mind, when you look every 4 years at the kind of interest globally that people have on the US elections, it's a demonstration of the preeminent position that USA, that Washington, DC, that the White House and the US president has on global affairs. It's non-Americans including Americans, who get impacted by decisions that are taken. Sometimes it's not even a decision. Sometimes it's a stray comment, but it sends ripples along the stock market, and it sends ripples across global communities. Because fortunes are made, misfortunes are created simply by the power of the White House. But as Jenny so wonderfully put it, and I was struggling to find a word when I was writing an article yesterday on the US elections. I thought of it, elections 2020, more like a suspense thriller. But she put it wonderfully. It's more like a soap opera. And quite frankly, the US elections are the greatest show on earth. And this year, many dramatic things happened. And speaking to a friend of mine who's an American and a great expert on China, she referred to it as a historic election. And let me give you some reasons as to why it's historic. First, for the very first time in US election history, 160 million plus people voted. It's never happened before. Second, even if Trump were to win, and I take the position that Biden has won the elections, even though Trump has threatened and promised to contest. Biden at 77 years old and Trump at 73, 74 years old, either of them would be the oldest presidents in US history. Third, if you look at the personalities of the two and their professional careers, nothing could be more different. Biden comes with 37 years in political office, 6 times elected senator. And President Trump, he's a sitting president today, but he didn't come with any political experience and most certainly no knowledge of how Washington works. So if you take all of these together and then add 2 more variables as to why it's historic. One is that if you look at the number of votes by which Biden won, it is still the highest in US history. But alongside, the number of votes that President Trump managed to get is also the highest that anyone else has ever won in US history. Take a third point. You have, for the first time in US electoral history, a woman of color, firstly a woman, and a woman of color who is the running mate. It's never happened before. So all of this, when you put these ingredients together in the melting pot, you truly have a soap opera, because for a long time, it was like a nail-biting finish. Indeed, in the initial day or two, it was certain that Trump was going to win the elections. Then as time evolved, it became neck to neck. And now, of course, as we know the final results that have come out, again, I say, come out, but contested. It is Biden's horse which galloped away. So I start with the premise that Joe Biden will be the 46th US president, and he will be in office on January 20th, along with the vice president, Kamala Harris. The news of today morning, and looking at Washington Post and New York Times, and many others, including The Guardian, Japan Times, what it says is that President Trump is going to leave the White House on schedule. He will not be removed from the White House, which is mercifully a good thing. But he says that the condition is that he will continue his fight because of his claims of, and I would say unsubstantiated claims of electoral fraud. Indeed, one of the allegations being made is that there has been a sinister hand in Venezuela. Now, what does this mean? This means that the transition, or what is also known as the handing over, is not going to be gentlemanly. It's going to be very, very acrimonious. And this is a pretty unsavory situation to be in. And I say all this as a background, because if we're going to ask ourselves, what are our expectations? And by our, I break it up into two parts. What is the global expectation from a Biden presidency? And then what is an Indian expectation from the presidency? We must be mindful of the fact that Biden is going to have a huge load put on his shoulders. And the very fact that it's not going to be a smooth transition is also worrisome, and is going to worry Biden. What are Biden's immediate priorities? Let's recognize that one of the most dramatic things that is plaguing the entire global community today is the pandemic. And I'm sure all of you would have tried to understand, analyze the impact of the pandemic. And very recently, I edited a book called The Phoenix Rises, Lockdown Chronicles. And a dear friend of mine, whom I've known since my school days, was also a well-known published author, Anjum Katyal. She said that, human beings tend to see life in a linear fashion. And so when you see life in a linear fashion, this pandemic then becomes an interruption. I disagree with Anjum, because to my mind, this pandemic is a devastating disruption. And let me story tell, so to speak, because when I had a chat with Nitish yesterday, he said that, look, there's two ways in which I can do this talk. One is to make it like a monologue and tell you facts that you already know. But the other is try to give you the big picture. And I'll opt for the latter. So let me explain to you what I think is a disruption and how it's going to impact not only the global community, but why it worries Joe Biden. Imagine if you're watching a film. And, there were those grand days when we would go to a cinema hall and watch a long film. And for those of you, most of you are very young, so you probably wouldn't know what I'm talking about. But if you went and watched a film like Dr. Zhivago or Gone with the Wind or My Fair Lady or Sound of Music or Where Eagles Dare, these are long films. And so what would happen in the middle is that there would be an intermission. And you'd get up and you'd go to the toilet or whatever it is, go and buy some popcorn, stretch your legs, come back, sit down, and the film would start. So if you were watching Dr. Zhivago would start. In a disruption, what happens is when you come back and sit down, Dr. Zhivago doesn't start. Some other entirely different film starts. Now that can be very, very confusing. And that is really the current situation that we are in. So when someone tells you that we are looking for returning back to the old normal, it's not going to happen. What's going to happen is a completely new scenario will confront us, and we need to be able to engage with that. So Biden faces two significant challenges with the pandemic. First, the ability to control it. And as you would have heard from his victory speech, he has made this his first priority. But he has also said that he's going to work very closely with scientists, with medical practitioners, with people in the cutting edge of the health sector in order to find a cure for the pandemic. The second is that the pandemic itself has disrupted not only economies around the world, but it has also impacted the US very severely. Unemployment figures today are among the highest that the US has ever encountered. Stock markets continue to be extremely volatile. And as you know about stock markets, what happens is a single thing, however rational it is or however irrational it is, will create a sense of extreme volatility. And this can create fortunes, but more importantly, it can trigger misfortunes. So the very first thing that is going to be, to my mind, a central focus for Biden would be the pandemic. The second thing that he would be looking at would be economic security. And the reason I say economic security is because for those of you who might be in various WhatsApp groups and might not have the time to browse through Washington Post and New York Times on a daily basis, unfortunately, it's part of my passion, so I do it on a regular basis. There are people, now there are reports. Some say that these are all fake, but I doubt if Washington Post and New York Times publish fake reports. But there are reports of long queues of people who don't have enough to eat. And I'm talking about the US on a daily basis. And these numbers are growing. Firstly, when you're talking about the preeminent global power in the world, the strongest economy in the world, the economy that can impact economies across the globe, if in that economy you have a situation where people don't have enough to eat, it creates a horrific situation for the US president. So I think the economic security situation is going to be paramount. Linked to economic security is the point I had mentioned earlier on, which is on unemployment. Unemployment figures have gone up in the US. But if you combine all three of them together, the largest number of people, according to published health data, who have been suffering from the pandemic, and this is, of course, across the board, unfortunately, again, is color. It is Afro-Americans who have been impacted very severely, possibly connected to the fact that they suffer from inequalities. And we've seen images. We've seen images of a horrific racial attack that took place. And Biden has referred to this as systemic racism. This would be the third area that would become a focus. And the reason that it would become a focus is not just because of moral issues involved, not just because the US Constitution talks in terms of it being a nation for all people, but also because it has come to the heart of another very, very critical area that was exposed through the contest between Trump and Biden. After all, Trump managed to get 74 million people voting for him. And while Biden got more than 80 million people voting for him, 74 million is among the highest ever in US electoral history that a defeated candidate has ever managed to obtain, which means the US is now split right from the top to the bottom, split in the center. Now, this divide is also being referred to in many writings as Trumpism. And what exactly does Trumpism mean? Trumpism means, and it might be difficult to immediately appreciate what I'm saying, but I'm happy to be questioned on it to elaborate. Trumpism is a sentiment where the majority people have a sense of being the minority. What does this mean? And all of a sudden, white Americans start feeling that they're the oppressed, that they're being denied. And it is this very, very strong sense that actually leads to people to move more and more to the right. Now, it is this divide that Biden would need to be able to heal. And I wrote a piece recently referring to something that I think captures it. I call it the Biden way. The Biden way is going to be, as Biden himself said in his victory speech, he's going to reach out to all Americans. Now, whether all Americans, a united America, would be something that he'd be able to pull along, would be his greatest test. And I think if you take these as a cluster of issues, they are going to preoccupy White House for at least 4 years. So Biden's primary focus is going to be domestic affairs. Now, what else is Biden going to do? When Biden takes over, there are certain decisions that his predecessor took, which he will immediately overturn. And one he has already hinted at, and he's already taken his first step in dismantling it. And I talk about the Paris Accord, which is essentially looking at the fact that there is climate change, which Trump denies, despite all the scientific evidence. But the Paris Accord, while it's all right for us to look at the environment and say that the environment needs to be protected, what is the fine print of the Paris Accord? The fine print of the Paris Accord is that the global community faces an extraordinary environmental danger, a danger that has been defined in the Paris Accord as an extraordinary, unique catastrophe. And the only way to overturn, initially to control, and then finally to overturn, is if there is a collaborative and collective effort in order to mitigate the problems of environmental damage. The fine print further goes on to say that corporate sector would need to play a leading role in this. Now, what does this mean actually? It means that the cost of doing business would actually rise. And Trump did not want that. And consequently, one of the decisions he took, and this is a decision he actually signed a few weeks before the elections took place, which is the US withdrawal from the Paris Accord. And Biden swore that he would overturn this. And he has taken his first significant step in this direction to the appointment of one of his aides, or if you like, members to his possible cabinet. Of course, all of this requires ratification from the Senate, etc. So can't refer to them as cabinet colleagues at this point of time, but it's a nomination. He has identified none other than the former Secretary of State, John Kelly. And who is John Kelly? John Kelly is the person who signed the Paris Accord with the authority of the President of the United States. John Kelly would become the Environment Secretary. Now, this is making the circle complete. So this is one decision of President Trump that most certainly will get overturned. What are the other decisions that he would immediately overturn? He has already promised that if he has to look at the economy, if he has to look at economic security, if he has to look at the fact that he needs to spend a lot of money on health. I flag health especially. If you look at, and you know, many people would be doing this. If you study who is Joe Biden, why is Joe Biden at the age of 77 wanting to sit in the White House and become the president of a fractured nation? Why on earth would he want to do this? I mean, he's not a poor person. He's wealthy. He can enjoy a good retired life. But Joe Biden has had several personal tragedies. As you might know, he lost his first child, who's an infant. and he lost a much older child not too long ago to brain cancer. The health sector has been a area of personal interest for him, and one of the fundamental and core decisions that President Trump took was to reverse Obamacare. There are, I think, in 2 weeks' time, this is going to come up for hearing, and there are legal suits and all kinds of issues that are involved. So it's not going to be easy to bring back Obamacare. But I do believe that Biden will make healthcare for all one of his critical priorities. It's not going to be an easy bridge to cross. It's going to be a far more difficult bridge to cross than overturning Trump's decision on the Paris Accord. But nevertheless, it'll be center stage. Again, this is a domestic issue that's going to be concerning him. But linked to all of this, I mean, where does the money come from? How do you create jobs? How are you going to deal with healthcare? How are you going to fund research in medical science? How are you going to fund research in areas like cancer in children? How are pharmaceutical companies going to produce drugs at an affordable price? At the end of the day, since you are all in the education sector, I think you will appreciate this far more than anyone else. You know, interventions like education, like health, like the fight or the war against poverty, the two critical pillars on which this rests are affordability and accessibility. You know, when you talk about online education, for example, it needs to be affordable, it needs to be accessible if it is to make a difference, if it is meant to transform lives. So where will this money come from? So during Trump's regime, or during Trump's tenure, regime is a wrong word, I apologize. But during Trump's tenure, one of the things he did was he didn't tax the rich. And what Biden has categorically said, and when you do a content analysis of the multiple speeches that he has made, what comes out is that he says that he's going to raise taxes for the rich. And from the taxes that he raises from the rich, he is going to start funding projects of this nature. So that's going to be Biden's immediate domestic concerns, his priorities, his main focus, his pillars, if you like. Yesterday, there was yesterday I read that yesterday, which means it would have been a day before yesterday, report which is about how many supporters of President Trump are going to stymie policies of Joe Biden, which have economic repercussions. And this includes the movement of monies. And so making sure that the funds are not available to deliver on significant promises. You know, I mean, if you say you're going to deal with the healthcare, it's not going to cost you $1, it's going to cost you millions of dollars. And so if he has to get these millions, so to speak, there needs to be a flow. You know, the stock of money has to be alongside the flow of money. And unless this happens, many of the promises would not occur. And in any case, Trump has on a few occasions said he's going to come back in 2024. And that's a very, very realistic possibility. That if he were to come back in 2024, one of the ways he can come back is by completely discrediting promises made by the Democrats, particularly Joe Biden, and saying that they make promises that they cannot fulfill. So let's recognize the fact that Joe Biden has a mountain to cross. Now, whether this mountain and the boulder on his shoulder is Sisyphean is a different matter. You know, the Greeks have this story about Sisyphus. Sisyphus was someone who used to worship the gods, But he was also a mischievous kind of guy. But the gods liked him because he was playful and he was good and he was great, and they gave him a lot of powers. But those powers got to his head. And he then started discarding the gods and treating them poorly. And then the gods decided to punish him. And they said, you'll spend the rest of your life carrying this boulder on your shoulder up a mountain. And then the boulder will roll down and you will carry it up the mountain. And the boulder will roll down. And you will do this till infinity comes. So what that story, it's a very powerful Greek story, what it says is that you can never solve the problem. Because every time you feel you've solved it, the problem comes back. And the whole idea of discrediting Biden would be to prevent him from succeeding. Which brings me to certain issues which go outside the borders of the US, which impact the global community. Now, when we look at this, let's start off by asking ourselves, who didn't or delayed congratulating Biden? Two countries, Russia and China. China very recently, I think it was it yesterday or day before, that Xi Jinping congratulated Biden. And then, of course, as is the Chinese practice, they said that hope the Americans will be realistic, and I hope the Americans will ensure that they play properly, so on and so forth. They give you a lecture when you congratulate. Moscow has still not issued a formal statement. But what intrigued me as a former diplomat of around 35 years is how come Moscow and China decided to, both of them jointly decided not to recognize Biden's victory. And I'll come back to this when I discuss India. But I think one of the critical areas is going to be, what would Biden's China policy be? With China, let's recognize this, is really the elephant in the room. Or, if you don't want to use the word elephant, the dragon in the room. And it's going to determine many aspects which you need to think about and see alongside the reaction, the response that Trump had. Now, and this again connects with India. Now, Trump's view on China coincided significantly with India's view on China. And Trump was aggressive. Trump actually initiated a significant trade war against Beijing. And all of this served Indian interests massively. Trump was behind the support given to Quad, which, as you know, is a set of naval exercises done by 4 countries, Japan, Australia, India, and the US. Trump was also extremely supportive of the Malabar exercises. Now, the Quad exercises have a specific purpose in mind. The Quad exercises, for those of you who follow the defense and, let's say, trade routes, 88% of all commercial naval traffic, shipping routes, go through what is now known as the South China Seas. Now, when the South China Seas start becoming, let's say, Chinese property, then there is a lot of worry that the sea routes can get disrupted. So Quad became an exercise by which certain amount of military arm flexing took place or takes place in order to tell the Chinese that, look, the only way you can block these routes is by using naval power, but we will open the routes by using our naval power. In other words, it's a threat. And it's a threat which has no element of soft power in it. It's a threat which is based entirely on a disbalance in military statements and military power. The Malabar exercises, on the other hand, recognize and accept a concept which actually started having traction when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. And that is to be able to see not the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean as separate, but as conjoined, and therefore to refer to the Indo-Pacific. So the Malabar exercises actually look at this whole thing as a continuity. And it has a lot of sense in it, because as you might know, Chinese nuclear submarines had entered Indian waters not once, but several times. India, of course, retaliated and sent its own nuclear submarine into so-called Chinese waters. But this is an aggressive game once again. And it is the tilting of the balance of power, or the tilting, if you like, or the assertion of the fact that the balance of power doesn't really have a balance. And it's a core and fundamental part of foreign policy and diplomacy to be able to say that, look, I don't think there's a balance of powers. I think one side is stronger than the other if national strategic security interests are threatened. And security includes food security, it includes economic security, it includes trade security. It's not just military security. So if shipping lines are disrupted, it's going to create global chaos and mayhem. Now, how will Biden react to this? Now, the Chinese make a lot of statements that it's important for us to be able to read and reread and go through over again to find out what exactly are they saying. What is behind the lines? What's the fine print? What's behind the word? And then there's a very powerful Chinese phrase, which I actually absolutely love. And it's not just related to China. It talks about that region. The Japanese have it. People in Southeast Asia have it. People in Nepal have it. And the Chinese word is mianze. Mianze means face. You never lose face. And that is a very, very powerful thing for us to always remember. If you take away face from someone, it's an insult. And so when you are discussing and negotiating, you need to be able to give space sufficiently enough, even when the person is, let's say, having to backtrack, where you do not humiliate, you do not humble. And to a large extent, many of the actions that Donald Trump took actually belittled China. And China is going through a traumatic period right now. Xi Jinping, and then if you go through the history of the Middle Kingdom, as it is called, you will find that the Chinese, who faced a lot of difficulties during the period of Chairman Mao Zedong, and then when Deng Xiaoping came and focused on building the Chinese economy and saying that, look, we're not going to bow down to anyone. We're going to build this economy. Deng Xiaoping made a very powerful statement to the Chinese people. He said, this is not the time to hold your head up high. This is the time to lower your head. A day will come when you will hold it up high. And that is the day when you assert your power. And Xi Jinping, who's now made himself the head of China, the head of the Communist Party for life, Xi Jinping believes that the time has come. And if you now humiliate Xi Jinping's China, then you do exactly what the Chinese are asking you de facto not to do. You make them lose face. You attack mianzi. And that is going to attract retaliation. Now, one of the things, and if you I'm sure have been following what happened in Ladakh. What happened in Ladakh was the Indians retaliated and caused significant damage to the Chinese. Now, there are reports that have come out in South China Post, South China Morning Post, and also reports within the Chinese press that this was a confrontation that China lost. Now, most people can sit down and say, should you have really done as much as you did? If you had done a little less, maybe the Chinese would not have lost face, and the Chinese would then be contained and controlled. There are others who say that it's a good thing that you did what you did because you showed your capabilities. In any case, what is also important for us to recognize that during Donald Trump's period, India and President Trump enjoyed a very strong equation and relationship, thanks to the personal equation that Prime Minister Narendra Modi enjoyed with President Donald Trump, to the extent that many of us, and then I say I'm one in the group who believes that he did something which is diplomatically not done, the breach of complete protocol to go to the United States and to endorse President Trump's candidature for a second term. Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar. Now, for a prime minister of a sovereign democratic government, of a sovereign country, do this in the United States, talking about President Trump when an election is coming, makes you take sides. So when Joe Biden takes over as president, the next question that would arise is, what is his policy towards China going to be? And what is the impact this is going to have? By the way, if someone, I'll keep talking. So if someone just interrupts me, I'd be most happy in case I'm touching 45 minutes. But let's recognize fundamentally that Joe Biden is going to be very different in terms of his policies towards China. One of the first statements that President Trump had made when he assumed the presidency, and I wrote a long piece on this for the Bombay-based think tank Gateway House, which was quoted in the New York Times, is that President Trump believes that uncertainty, being unpredictable, needs to be a core element of US foreign policy. And consequently, diplomats across the globe, economists across the globe, even Americans, had absolutely no clue as to what he was going to do, when he was going to do it, why was he doing it, and whether he would stick by what he had done. You found a lot of people losing their jobs, a high position, cabinet ministers losing their jobs, changing them right, left, and center. And as part of the business school, you will realize that when you have uncertainty in an enormous and significant manner becoming part of the equation, it actually enhances risk. And while all of us do risk assessment studies, one of the things that we recognize and we understand, and there's a lot of writings on this. Pareto did an entire study to be able to explain that human beings accept uncertainty. They accept unpredictability, but it needs to be within a band which is predictable. While this might sound dichotomous, actually what you're saying is that if you had a band, the uncertainty would be within that band, and therefore there would be a predictable element to the unpredictability. In Biden's case, you will have old diplomacy, which means that Biden is going to be predictable. And Biden will abandon this sense of uncertainty, which many people say was uncertainty to the extent of complete chaos that Trump introduced. So you will have a more, let's say, understandable system, a system which you can negotiate and work with. And if you didn't understand it, or if there was something that you disagreed with, you could then take it back to the drawing board. But how focused is Biden going to be on international relations? I believe that one of the things, and there's this great saying, which I'm sure your faculty would have told all the students all the time. There's a great saying, which is, "It's the economy, stupid." And what it essentially translates into is that economic considerations always outweigh political considerations, unless there is a dramatic threat perception. For instance, I mean, the Chinese incursion into Doklam, into Ladakh, their interests in Arunachal Pradesh. Now that's a dramatic overturning of the balance. That is the introduction of a completely new sequence of events. But if you minus those, usually it is economic considerations that far outweigh political consideration. There are ample examples of this, and I will share two with you very quickly. And if you look at Australia, if you look at the United States, I mean, what are the statements that keep coming all the time when there are joint statements that presidents sign or prime ministers sign? And they are that how India and Australia, or India and the United States, are brought together because of shared aspirations and shared concerns, and how we have shared values. How democracy is so powerful, it brings us together. But when you sit down and look at the economic page, they do far better business and far stronger business with China. And please look at the history. Even at the height of Trump's strong position against Beijing, US investments in China and Chinese investments in the United States did not decrease. There's a strong study by S.Y. Prasad from Cornell University, which categorically demonstrates that they actually went up, even at the height of so-called crisis. So it's important for us to recognize that the economy is going to be a very strong player in the Biden administration as well. So when he or his administration deal with other countries, the focus is going to be the economy. There would most certainly be other considerations on certain issues. I mean, the Paris Accord, for example, is an other consideration. Trump also decided that he dislikes the UN for whatever reasons that there might be, that the WHO did not behave itself. It took a pro-China position. And many would argue that he was right. I mean, I remember that it was in November of last year that I read while browsing through the net that there was a strange problem that was taking place in Wuhan. And, in the middle of December, there is this conference that UNSW participates along with Terry, and it's called the Griha Summit. And my vice chancellor had come, and we were talking about it. And what popped up was that there was another couple of cases in Wuhan that people were not able to understand. At the end of December, the Chinese said that, look, I think this damn thing is contagious. On January 11th, WHO said that there's a problem, and there's a problem in China. And as you know, by March 13th, if I remember correct, pandemic was declared by WHO. And on 23rd March, India went into lockdown. And indeed, I mean, by then there was chaos and devastation taking place. And really devastation. India should, I think, by the end of December, have over 10 million cases. This whole situation, where the reports that were coming from WHO, which, as you know, within 24 hours, they were retracting what they were saying, and this didn't happen once, it happened multiple times. The faith in an international institution diminished, and Trump took a very severe stand. It was the pot boiling because at one level he took a stand against the UN. And he, in any case, had asked that the UN should cut down its costs and expenses. And he said the United States is not going to pay because, all countries, all member countries, depending on the size of their GDP, make contributions to the UN. And he decided to block it. So the Americans stopped paying. And then he suddenly made a critical statement with regard to NATO. And he said that, look, you guys have to start looking after yourselves, and demonstrated, in fact, through a series of very, very critical and tough statements that the US was going to back out of an alliance that was constituted following the Second World War, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, on this foreign and security and defense policy, I believe that Biden would take a much softer stand. I think Biden will once again bring it back to even keel. He's already nominated one of the most distinguished Foreign Service officers who actually almost lost her job, sidelined completely during the Trump administration, an Afro-American senior diplomat who I've had the honor of meeting quite a few times, will take over as the American permanent representative to the UN. So these would be shifts and changes. But the more important element of Biden in his presidency is going to be his reliance on the people he selects as his cabinet ministers, or rather nominates as his cabinet ministers. John Kelly, looking at environment, Vivek Murthy in the health front, and of course you have Antony Blinken looking at foreign policy. And let me end by giving some words of caution. And then I'm happy to take as many questions as you might want to ask, which is, Indians tend to get, Indian media tends to get over-enthusiastic and overreact and overreach. And they make a lot of significant miscalculations. Let me name a few which are prejudicial to Indian interests. One, if you remember, at one stage, there was a lot of discussion with regard to the pandemic and the COVID-19 vaccine, and they were talking about hydrochlorine as quinine as being the antidote, and a leading television news. And I say this is the bane of 24/7 news reporting, where you do not fact check before you publish and make announcements. It said that that President Trump himself personally had rung up Prime Minister Modi and threatened action if the medicine was not sent to the United States. Now, this is as factually incorrect as assuming that Mount Everest does not exist. And it's one of the most absurd statements, because when the transcript of what President Trump had said was announced, what President Trump said is that I will speak to my good friend, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and make a request. And I do hope it might be possible. I am also aware that Indians have never refused any request that helps the global community, which is totally different from saying that President Trump threatened India. Let's take some more cases. Let's take the case of Kamala Harris. Now, I don't know how many of you have noticed this on WhatsApp, how Kamala Harris makes dosas, how Kamala Harris hasn't forgotten her Indian roots. Most certainly she hasn't forgotten. How in Kamala Harris's village, there were temple prayers being said. Now, all of this seems to suggest and boil down to Kamala Harris, because she's of Indian origin, is only going to make statements which are pro-India. This is not true. This is not true. Please remember that inherent in the Democrats' DNA is the fact that they will uphold many of the statements that people like Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, very strong people in US presidential history have spoken about. They don't believe that certain things are internal matters of a country. They will talk about what they feel are global issues. They will champion democracy. They will champion human rights. And most certainly, my good friend, my college friend, Dr. Jaishankar, who is the External Affairs Minister, refused to meet a US senator, again of Indian origin, who said that she wanted to discuss Kashmir and she wanted to discuss Article 370. She wanted to discuss the Union Territory status of Jammu and Kashmir. And she also wanted to discuss the relationship that the government has with rightist parties and how it is affecting minorities, especially Muslims. Now, all of this was considered complete anathema as far as India is concerned. And we tend to believe that because a person is of Indian origin, that person's policies would 100% be pro-India. This is not true. This is not true. And the sooner we recognize this, the better for us. As Nitish said, there is a realistic possibility that Kamala Harris could be a president and could be the president of the United States at some point of time. Is she supposed to look after Indian interests, or is she supposed to look after American interests? Now, while it might be a wonderful thing that the entire global community sits down and votes as to who should be the next president in the White House, that is not going to be happening. And the sooner India adjusts to this critical fact, the better it is for India. So what does the US presidential election, Joe Biden's presidency, essentially boil down to the way India would be impacted? And I'll make a set of recommendations. One, the first salvo has already been fired by Pakistan in reaching out to Washington, D.C. to say that they would like to work closely with Washington and revisit the relationship. What did Pakistan do simultaneously to issuing this démarche? They arrested Mr. Hafiz Saeed and a number of his aides, people who are actually wanted by India and have been identified by the government of India as being the masterminds behind 26/11. The timing is very interesting, and to my mind, gives a message to Washington, D.C. to say that, look, we don't believe in terrorists. The facts are, of course, completely different. Second, China knows that the United States under Joe Biden is going to react very differently from the United States under Donald Trump. During Mr. Donald Trump's tenure, there were a lot of expectations in terms of defense and military, counterintelligence, satellite imagery, etc., that we could rely on. Now, whether this is going to happen or not is a matter of speculation. In my view, Biden would Antony Blinken will allow certain things from happening, provided it's not provocative. And please also recognize that when Antony Blinken spoke alongside Joe Biden in one of the election speeches, he said how difficult China is and how it's important that we collectively take a stand against China's hegemonic interests and hegemonic pursuits, and its belligerence, its aggressiveness. And again, a leading television studio said, in Antony Blinken, we will find an ardent supporter on our China policy. To my mind, this is really jumping the gun, because what needs to be seen when you look at that speech once again and do a little bit more homework is, who was he speaking to? He was speaking at a gathering of Indian Americans. And to the Indian Americans, this sounded like poetry and music. But that's not the way it goes. Ultimately, when the Secretary of State takes a decision, he's not going to take a decision trying to appease Indian Americans. In any case, the small number of Indian Americans in the US, which is less than 1%, and its impact on the electoral votes are not going to move and shake. They are, in any case, Democrats. The bulk of them, the majority of Indian Americans are Democrats. So Democratic support is already very much there. Secretary of State will take decisions that enhance US credibility in the global community and does not draw the US into yet another problem when they're grappling with a domestic set of issues, which are really the large boulder on Biden's head. The third point I'd like to make is that Indians, and many of us have fallen victim to this in diplomacy. We say that nothing's going to happen. We enjoy bipartisan support, and which is true. The Republicans and the Democrats both endorse that India-US enjoys a very strong strategic partnership. And we also know that from our side, whether it's the government under Prime Minister Narendra Modi or Prime Minister Vajpayee or Dr. Manmohan Singh, there was continuity in policy. Bipartisan support is what this means. But we need to ask ourselves, what exactly does bipartisan support translate into? Does it mean that Biden will behave like Trump vis-a-vis China and Pakistan? The answer is no. The answer is no. Bipartisan support is welcoming a rubric, an umbrella, where you do acknowledge and accept that India is a strategic partner, but the translation of that statement into action will vary. And I think we should not take our bipartisan support into granted to believe that if there is a next, let's say, military incursion or an encounter with China, that the Americans would come scrambling down to assist us. It's not likely to happen. And no country should actually put eggs in one basket. I mean, no one should put eggs in one basket, as all of you would appreciate and recognize. A final point I'd like to make is that if you want a strong relationship with the global community and with global leaders, and I talk about the US, you need to keep two things in mind. One is that any relationship is based on mutual self-interest. In the process of making new friends, never abandon old friends. And one of the strong old friends who I believe feels abandoned is Moscow. And which is why I said some time ago, did Moscow and Beijing coordinate positions on delaying congratulating Biden? And if indeed they did so, did Moscow speak to Delhi and say, this is what we're going to be doing and why? The answer is Moscow did not speak to Delhi. Now, if you're going to push aside Moscow in wanting to come close to Washington, which is what Trump wanted us to do, then there are consequences. Linked to this is the next and final point. Unless India is able to be economically strong, the interest that countries have in India will be peripheral, and they would be only in terms of language. A strategic partnership, shared interest, shared aspirations, shared concerns. What does it translate into? Lack of investment. Without investment, without trade, I'm sorry, it's the economy. And economic considerations override political relationships. What they do is, if you have a strong economic base, it strengthens the political relationship. So I think we're in for a very interesting period. I think this is India put all its eggs again, into the Trump basket. But this is a time for introspection. This is a time for realism. And this is the time for India to actually grow strong and recognize that if you want friends, even friends want to ask, what's in it for me? And right now, with the global economy down, what's in it for me is, does it impact my GDP in a positive manner? Thank you very much. It's been a great honor, great honor speaking to all of you. And I would welcome any questions.
All right. So we do have a few questions that have come in. We have Soumyajit who asks, Sir, it will be helpful to have some color on the larger game that's playing out currently under Trump in the Middle East, along with Saudi Arabia and Israel, against a possible grouping of Iran, China, and others. So, under a Biden presidency, can any reversals be expected under Biden? And how would India be impacted by all of this?
Under Trump, as you might know, India was asked to soft pedal its relationship with Tehran. Trump got a lot of things that Trump wanted and that India was made to accede to, sir. And one of them is, very interestingly, India buys oil, believe it or not, from the United States. I don't know if you saw today's newspaper, but a leading Iranian nuclear scientist was assassinated yesterday. And while there are no formal comments which have come from Israel, it clearly demonstrates a very strong possibility that this was a Mossad-driven attack. Who is the one person who publicly said that Trump's exit is the most disastrous thing that would happen? It was Benjamin Netanyahu. And the Israeli president is distressed. And that's because President Trump put it very clear that his Middle East policy was going to be driven entirely by a strong hand. And to a large extent, the global community also appreciated the fact that Donald Trump took a very hardline view on not only Islamic fundamentalism and Islamic terrorism, but the fact that many countries in the Arab world were instrumental in trying to foment this trouble. But as you and I know, and if you look at the history of where, with the exception of Osama bin Laden, where many of the terrorists came from, they actually came from places like Somalia, from Libya, from Sudan, from Algeria. They didn't all come from directly from the Arab countries. The Arab countries themselves have suffered at the hands of Islamic terrorists. You know the famous attack that took place in Mecca, where it was necessary for the Saudis could not enter Mecca with weapons. So as you know, the famous story that took place, French mercenaries came and they took out the terrorists. And prior to doing that, since only Muslims can enter Mecca and the Holy Kaaba area, the French mercenaries converted to Islam before they did all this. So there's a very complex situation. Must also recognize the fact that a terrible incident took place of a US national of Saudi origin, a journalist, and how he was brought into the Saudi embassy, killed, chopped up, put into a suitcase, disposed of. Now, despite US, let's say, misgivings, Washington's misgivings on Saudi Arabia, economic interests prevailed. And the Americans did not, beyond a point, raise or arm twist the situation. The Saudis, of course, did a token reaction to it. The prince, who was the person who all the fingers pointed towards, executed a number of people who he said clearly misunderstood what needed to be done, and they were the criminals. So I think US policies under Joe Biden will see a dramatic shift. You will essentially see the Biden administration not getting into controversies. you will see them talking more, using dialogue, but not using arm twisting as a weapon. Trump, on the other hand, decided that dialogue doesn't help. Arm twisting is the way to go. Now, which is the better way, which is the worse way, I think depends on situations. I think the soft peddling on China will go against our interests. So Biden's softer, more moderate approach. On LinkedIn, you might find an interview I did of Ambassador Frank Wisner, and Frank, seasoned diplomat, initially said that we need to contain China. And so when I said that, look, I mean, is it going to be a relationship of engagement, strategic engagement with China, or strategic containment with China? Frank immediately then jumped and corrected himself and said that, look, containment is a bad thing. We shouldn't be containing China. Frank, as you know, is a Democrat. He's going to be a very strong advisor to Joe Biden. He said, what we need is moderation in our policies towards Beijing. So I think you will see a very, very moderate policy unless US national strategic and security interests are impacted. I don't know if this answers your question, sir, but I hope it does.
We have Nikhil Modak, who shares that trade wars with China will continue. He also adds that China was also planning to finance the Kra Canal project, which will change the political equation in the ASEAN region. We have Mudit Jain, who asks, Amit ji, my question is, was the Chinese incursion into Galwan a signal that China wants the waters of the Siachen Glacier, not related to the Biden presidency, but very important for India?
Yeah, so I'll start with Mudit's question. I mean, the answer is yes. And I think there are if you Google it, there are a series of studies done, and there is a very strong talk by Dr. Iyer, where satellite imagery show very clearly that the whole dispute is with regard to the waters. There is also a strategic non-water related issue, and which is that it's easier to win a skirmish, if you like, or a battle, or to have a vantage point if you're at a higher level geographically. So to shoot down is easier than shooting up. And so if you have artillery positions at a higher altitude than the valley, then it's easy to pick up the so-called enemy troops. And so I think there was a military objective, and there was also a resource objective. So Mudit, I totally agree with you. And on the earlier question, I would say that the entire relationship, now, for example, if we are looking at China and the ASEAN, I think let's expand it from ASEAN. Let's just say Southeast Asia, and look at that whole region. They're all dependent. I mean, what is the core thing about China? If you look at Africa, if you look at Australia, what is the core thing? I mean, I don't know how many of you know that the second most widely spoken language in Australia happens to be Mandarin. And the most critical thing is China locks you economically. And once you're locked economically, to try and disrupt that relationship has devastating economic implications for yourself. And therefore you remain locked in. I think, and then of course they have this other wonderful argument of the string of pearls, which I once had written about, calling it the rope around the neck. And what China wanted to do was economically look at Bangladesh, look at Sri Lanka, look at Maldives, look at Pakistan, string of pearls, and lock them in economically, and then pressurize India. I think the Americans will be looking at the RCEP, will be looking at the TPP in a very critical manner, because what it knows is that if you want to control the Indo-Pacific, the way to control it cannot simply be left to a military control. It has to be an economic and trade and an investment control as well.
Mudit has another question. Amitji, do you think there will be a war or skirmish between China and Taiwan?
Um, because I think there's going to be a moderate policy. What happens is that policies of moderation mean that you abandon certain things. Now, policy of moderation means that you're not going to handhold His Holiness the Dalai Lama. You are not going to raise the issue of Hong Kong beyond a point. And even if you raise it, you're not going to intervene. You're really not going to sit down and send in, the Sixth Fleet or the Seventh Fleet to protect Taiwan. It's not going to happen. You will complain. You will raise it in the UN, but does China really care? So I think Taiwan and many others felt that they had a good chance when Trump was around. I think everyone will quieten down when Biden comes. Moderation will be the key.
Satyajit Jha has a question. Please elaborate more on predicting Biden's decision on domestic economy beyond healthcare, how India and US economic collaboration can increase in the short and long run.
Look, I think India's any collaboration with India economically on the trade and investment front is that India has to take a series of hardcore economic reforms and fiscal reforms, ease of business. Unless this happens, I don't see a strong economic partnership that India can have with any country. Because people believe in captive markets. You've seen the reaction to Prime Minister Scott Morrison's decision with regard to Beijing. The entire business community in Australia has protested and has said that, look, hang on, you need to backtrack. Now, because they are locked in, economically they're locked in. Now, if you tell them that, look, we are a democracy and China is not a democracy and therefore come to India, they would say, yeah, no problem. Do you have ease of doing business? Do you have infrastructure? Do these exist? Till they actually do, I don't see a significant jump in our economic and trade relations. There will be an incremental increase, but not a significant jump. Ask yourself fundamental and basic question. When Prime Minister Modi went to UAE, what did the UAE government say? It said, we're willing to invest $75 billion into the Indian economy. And what did what did we do? We told ourselves we don't have the capacity to absorb $75 billion at this point of time. And so that's where we are. So let's be realistic and recognize the fact that the Indian economy requires significant reforms before it's attractive.
Kavya Sangam has a question. Social media played a huge role during the 2016 US elections as well as the 2020 elections in influencing the opinions of the general public. Thus, social media cannot be taken lightly. How do you think Biden can leverage social media during his administration for catering to the pulse of the public?
I think, a lot of pressure is being put. If you look at the social media right now, and I don't know how many of you follow the different kinds of WhatsApp messages going around, the interventions on Fox News, etc. They are very, very vicious, and they discredit. Biden has been portrayed as a person who may not survive 4 years. They have caught him in conversations, made snippets, added these together, and demonstrated how he's completely senile. He slurs when he speaks, and he mixes up words. So is Biden going to follow the same track? I don't think so. As I said, the Biden way is going to be the way of the healer. He is going to try and heal America. So while he will use social media, I think he will try and use it in a more positive way, in a way of reaching out, rather than in a way of distancing, which is what the Trump social media team did. They wanted to bring down and demonstrate to you that this 77-year-old man is not capable of being the president. As you know, there were a lot of discussions on his health. And again, if you Google, you will find that doctors dealing with Biden have demonstrated that, have shown very objectively that he is physically quite fit, he's mentally quite fit, that health is not a concern or a worry. Yet the social media completely devastates Biden. So I don't think he's going to be drawn into that game. As I said, he's going to play the role of the healer. And that means he's going to think much bigger. Look, I mean, he's 77. At the age of 77, after having 37 years in political life, why would he want to be president? He will also think of legacy, and he would like to be remembered as a person who was kind and got the job done.
Rohan Arora's question is related to Kavya's question. What measures do you think can be taken to curb the spread of misinformation and propaganda in today's social media driven environment?
Oh, this is a very difficult one. I have no clue. And I have no clue for multiple reasons. One is that sometimes misinformation helps the government. Because and so why would someone want to curb misinformation? So I think it's very important for us to ask ourselves who is misinforming and what is the objective behind misinforming. So in an ideal world, one can take an objective view on this. But I would say that when you read something, read it 8 or 10 times. One of the forwards, just as an example, tell you, one of the forwards that came to me from a friend of mine who's in Alaska, of all places, is that Haldiram products have dead insects and all kinds of things, and it's completely contaminated. And I read that and I was very disturbed about that because it was the early years of the pandemic. And I must confess that I was indulging in a lot of moong dal from Haldiram. And then I started Googling. And I ultimately ended up speaking to someone from Haldiram. And he said, look, this report is 10 years old. And yes, there were problems. And yes, we have taken corrective action. I think don't trust anything that you read. Counter check it. So if you read a report, don't just believe in it.
Varad has a similar question. Are we getting into social media driven politics?
I think so. And so one should never discount the power of the social media. I don't know how many of you followed the Arab Spring. And that was something which was of great interest to me for a long time. And if you remember the Arab Spring, which started off in places like Tunisia, there was interest among the people, and then there was this man with a beard. I'm forgetting his name, who decided to commit suicide. He did exactly what a Buddhist monk did in Vietnam. He set himself on fire. But when he set himself on fire, he did it on social media. And it just went like wildfire all over the place. And it is attributed, that singular act is attributed as being the catalyst for a conflagration that then went from Tunisia all the way to cover 4 countries, because it just went viral. It got global attention. Because people started watching this. They watched a man die, and they watched it. And all he did was to say that I'm protesting for a simple fact. As a citizen, I have a right to question my government, and I'm questioning my government. But since my government doesn't hear me, this is the way of getting attention. So never discount social media.
A question from Vinay. With India not being part of RCEP, wanted to understand its impact on Indian economy and a resultant political relationship with ASEAN.
So I think, India is not a part of RCEP, which is correct. And one of the things that India said was that we are not part of RCEP because RCEP, as it stands today, is counterproductive and goes against our national interests. And unless there are amendments to a series of clauses, India would not be able to join RCEP in its present form. And my External Affairs Minister has reiterated this 3 days ago. So I think the door to RCEP is not closed. India believes that in its present form, Indian exports would be disadvantaged. Indian imports into India would be enhanced. So while India doesn't want to be a fortress, as was alleged with regard to Europe in the earlier days, India would still like a level playing field. And you and I know that playing fields are never level, but they can't be completely biased against, let's say, one country's interest. And focused on inflows from China in this particular case. It is also a matter of negotiating with China, and so whatever bilateral relations India has with Beijing, trade and opening up of trade would be very much one of the negotiating ploys on other negotiations, whether it's with Doklam or Ladakh or anything else. So it's a leverage point.
The next question, I'm not sure who sent this. Amit sir, any chance of easing the US sanction on Iran, and eventually can India deal with Iran in crude oil?
I think India can deal with Iran on crude oil. I don't think Joe Biden is going to be as obstructive on that. I think there will be an easing of sanctions, provided Iran also shows goodwill from their side. I think they are really with their backs to the wall. There's not only been a sanction, there is an assassination which has taken place. It's a series of events. The question is, between now and January 20th, what else is President Trump going to, let's say, permit? It is impossible to believe, really, and I say this hand on heart, that the American intelligence had no clue that an assassination took place, and that the American intelligence could not have prevented it. Now, are such assassinations in global welfare, part of global welfare? I don't think so. Why did the assassination take place? The assassination took place, and for me, the clear reading on this is that Biden's policies towards Iran, towards Tehran, will be much, much softer than Trump's policies would be. And consequently, assassinating a leading nuclear scientist more or less puts back Iran where, let's say, Israel would like it to be.
Satyajit has another question. It may be off topic, but how can India grow with conservative spends and the way the economy has been tackled since the last decade? Even key economic data like unemployment data by a government institute is denied by the government in case it's not in line with the government goodwill.
Look, I think in democracies and in all kinds of governance, these are issues that take place. I mean, you have to take it on the chin. You have to live with this. Now, if you and I believe that we can get the government to publish realistic, correct, authenticated data, and that all of us can live with, I think it doesn't happen. I think what's happened is today people are suspicious about the data. I was discussing with a school friend of mine, Kaushik Basu, and I actually went on record. I mean, at one of the talks that I had given, in my estimation, the GDP, the negative GDP growth, is not the figure that the government is talking about today of -7 point whatever it is, but it's in double digits. And the question is, whose form of calculation is correct? Now, the government changed calculation systems for even identifying GDP growth rate. Now, I frankly have no response to your question other than to say that you have to work with the situation as it is. You can either make a mission of our life to get correct data, or we can make the mission of our life to upgrade economic performance. And I believe one of the great things about institutions like the one that you're part of, the SP Jain School of Global Management, and part of, I teach at the business school at UNSW. So as part of all of this, great institutions have one thing very focused, which is irrespective of what is seen or read or et cetera, around the immediate environment that you're part of. What you see physically as you walk down the street is the most critical indicator of reality. And I remember many, many years ago when I was the first secretary in Brussels, my ambassador at that time was one of the great economists of the world, and indeed a great economist in India. His name was Arjun Sengupta. And he had studied at none other than MIT, from where he got his PhD. And we had a visit by the Standing Committee of External Affairs in the Parliament visiting us, and was led by none other than the very, very wonderful Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And Orjunda gave a talk on the Indian economy and how we could improve through our interaction with the European Union. And after listening to it with his eyes closed for about an hour, Atal Vajpayee ji asked Orjunda, Ambassador, can you tell me the price of onions in Delhi? And Ambassador Sengupta had no clue. You see, data is one thing, but what is really critical, and what all your teachers will tell you, and what all the faculty has taught me and told me, is that take a walk on the street, and what you see is really what it is, not just the data. So I think it's possible to sift through manipulated data and real data.
Kavya has a question. Gen Z showed a very active interest in politics and the 2020 elections. In fact, the interest was spurred during the Black Lives Matter movement itself. How do you think Gen Z can create conditions conducive for Biden to effectively administrate US?
I think there's Jenny can perhaps correct me. There's this great image. Is it St. Mike, where with a spear is standing on the devil?
Yes.
Yeah, and one of the great stories of that, if you look at that image carefully, the devil is black. The foot is on the neck of the devil, and it's what Biden said was that the gods that we worship and who drive us became part of our psyche and becomes part of something that you accept. When Floyd was killed, it was the same image of a white policeman with his knee on the neck. Now, Black Lives Matter, and then there are two very powerful videos doing the rounds, which is about one of them has a Sikh community person who must be third generation in the US, talks about Black Lives Matter, and very, very powerful. So what can Gen Z do? I think Gen Z needs to recognize that the healing that takes place has to first begin with understanding the dimension of a problem. I mean, you recognize this in the business school, which is that if you want to tackle a problem, you must first know what the problem is. And unless you know the problem in its entire size and totality, it's very difficult for you to do an intervention. And then it's not possible to just, let's say, tackle the problem through legislation. In order to tackle a problem, you need to tackle it through direct intervention. Now, for example, the government of India has a lot of legislation which says that, which says a lot of wonderful things, that, women are equal, they need to be treated equally, you have to do this, that, and the other. There's no end to the legislations. Now, these are important. Regulatory mechanisms are always important, but regulatory mechanisms fail unless there is implementation. So what can Gen Z do? I think it's important to work alongside the government in this process of what I call healing. And healing is not just emotional healing. You just don't tell the person, look, I mean, we've read this very sad story, haven't we, about this girl who was a very bright student at LSR, which is a Lady Shri Ram College in Delhi, very prestigious. And she went and committed suicide because her parents couldn't afford to buy her a laptop. Now, is just buying the laptop and giving it to her as a gift, as a community project, would that have prevented the suicide? I think it's understanding the bigger picture and participating in resolving the bigger picture. And you will participate only if you accept that that problem is a critical problem that needs to be addressed. Until such time as you recognize that, it's not going to work. I mean, I keep saying something which is a horrible thing to say, I suppose, and all of you might criticize me for it. But I've always said that the big problem that India faces is from Indians, and that's because we are a very me kind of people. You know, we are individualistic. We're not collaborative. We're not a collective. We're not a we. And for Gen Z to actually work with Biden requires fundamentally that the problem is not just Biden's. The problem is an American problem. So if we similarly counterpose that, and if I were to ask each and every one of you, the problems that India faces, is that a problem which is the problem for the government? Or is that a problem which is the problem for all of us? And therefore, a collective intervention in resolving the problem.
All right, so we're going to take one final question, and this is from Bharat. I believe he's one of our BBA students. His question is, since you mentioned that China forces country into economic lockdown, and many of us, after a few years, will graduate in Australia, can the economic lockdown affect us after 3 years?
Yeah. So Bharat, firstly, I mean, I wish you all the best, and really, you and all the other fellow students of yours who are currently completing in your 2 years in Sydney. I wish you a very bright future. Let us accept fundamentally that China is a critical economy, and whatever we might say in terms of, I mean, we might all love to hate China. I mean, it's we don't like the Chinese way. We don't like the fact that they're hegemonic. We don't like the fact that they're aggressive. We only like Chinese food. So let's accept all that. But let's also accept the fact that whatever areas of economic activity that you're looking at, the Chinese are focused, the Chinese deliver, and the very fact that China is able to lock countries economically in and make them dependent is really to China's credit. So when you do graduate, will this situation have changed completely? It can change only if China is substituted by some other country. Now, what is everyone expecting? They're expecting that India will become the substitute. And very strangely, very, very strangely, there have been public statements to say that the counterpoise to China, to Beijing is New Delhi. I think this is not realistic. And even if all intervention, suddenly drama takes place, and the economy is put on the rails in India, and everyone stands focused, and we become single-minded like the Chinese, we are not likely to substitute them in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. It's not going to happen. So I do believe that China's dominance in the world would continue. And there are areas, of course, that even Biden will be mindful of. For example, intellectual property rights. He's going to be mindful of that. Piracy. He's going to be mindful of that. But he's also going to be mindful of the fact that China has invested heavily in innovation, in ideas, in technology, and it's very, very far advanced. And you can't brush it under the carpet. So there is going to be engagement, and China will engage with the world, because it is only through the engagement that China's economy will grow stronger and grow faster and continue to grow sustainably. And at the end of the day, the measure of economic growth is sustained performance. It's not a one-off. And so, yes, I think there is a bright future ahead. And to be mindful that while one can see negatives in a situation, in a relationship, one should also see positives in it. I mean, there are lots of negatives about the pandemic, for example, but believe me, there are a lot of positives. If it wasn't for the pandemic, online education would not, in an abbreviated period of time, leapfrog. Our whole perceptions about online have changed. So every situation, no matter how negative it is, has positives. So with China, we need to be very mindful that we may dislike hundreds of things that they do, but then there are many others that can be leveraged to our advantage, and we should make sure that our focus is self-interest driven. In this case, I'm saying not individual self-interest only, but a national self-interest.
Right, Amit, thank you. Over to you, Mr. Jain, once again.
Thank you, Jenny.
Hi, Amit.
Hi.
I'm conscious of the fact that we've already run over 20 minutes and the questions haven't ended. So it just shows how much people were engaged with this discussion this morning, Amit. On behalf of all of us, we really thank you for taking your very valuable time to be with us on this Saturday morning and share your thoughts with us. I had made a lot of notes to thank you, by going through a summary of what you said, but that will take forever because I have 10 pages of notes. But just a quick one to summarize, what you've said. And I think the main point is that India needs to learn to stand on its own 2 feet, as opposed to counting on a relationship between the prime minister and the president. And that had been so for the last 4 years. So I think it's a very important message that you've given to India. And I think that is should actually drive the Indian policy, the economic policy. So once again, I do appreciate very, very much the time that you've taken. And, as the questions keep coming up, if some of you are interested, you could write to us and post them on this chat, and we can get back to you later after talking with Amit. So thanks everyone for your participation, for your engagement. And of course, once again, thanks to you, Amit, and to Jenny for moderating this so well. And for Bharat and others, I just want to share with you one quick point that Amit was the dean in Mumbai when in the first year of the BBA, and he took the trouble to be in Sydney when they graduated, and he gave a fantastic talk to the students who were under his leadership in Mumbai during this period. And I will try and get him to Mumbai. I know we're in the middle of a pandemic, but I will try to organize at least a talk with Amit, with all of you, because you would be so enlightened with his very vast knowledge on so many different subjects. So with that, I'll say bye, Amit. Thank you, and take care, everyone. Please.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, all of you. It's deeply grateful for the invitation to participate, And as Nitish said, if you have questions, if you'd like to interact, like to keep in touch, just give me a shout.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely weekend.